Welcome to the Ground Up Podcast. I hope you're enjoying these episodes on building biodiversity, resilience, and sustainability from the ground up. In this episode, I'm re-releasing an interview I did with author Dan Eagan at the 2024 Outside Sustainable Landscapes Collaborative. Dan is a journalist in residence at the Center for Water Policy at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee School of Freshwater Policy. He is the author of The Life and Death of the Great Lakes and The Devil's Element, Phosphorus and a World Out of Balance. I hope you enjoyed this episode with Dan Eagan. First things first, Dan, would you please autograph my copy of your book? I have to say I really enjoyed this book. I read it and then I reread it in preparation for today, and it's just as good the second time.
I'm a slow writer. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's going on the shelf.
Yeah, I'm a reporter, so it's chicken scratch. Can you read that?
No.
I'm sorry. Tim, you're doing great work and are a great host. Dan.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. I got to work on that.
Well, you are a very good writer, despite the autograph, the handwriting. No, seriously, tell us what inspired you to write a book on phosphorus.
Well, it's up there. This Death and Life of the Great Lakes was a book that I spent probably 12 or 13 years writing. I didn't know I was writing a book at the time. I was doing project work for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and by project work I mean like long stories. And every year I do a really long story. And then I'd been doing that since like 2002. And in 2012, I took a break and went to Columbia University. And it wasn't much of a break because it was a master's program. And I was there with a wife working on her own master's and 4 kids who were 5th grade and younger. But part of that program, besides testing our marriage and family, was a book writing seminar. And from that book writing seminar came this book. And one of the chapters in the book is about Lake Erie, and Lake Erie is ravaged by toxic algae, which is caused by phosphorus overloading, like no other lake, because it's such a big one, and so many people depend on it for drinking water. So when I finished this Great Lakes book, the publisher, it was humming along, selling well, and he's like, "What do you want to do next?" And I said, "Phosphorus," and I thought he would be like, "Yeah." He's like, "What? A whole book?" And that's what I did. I mean, I talked him into it. It's really, I still deal with this. I'm probably dealing with, well, not in this crowd because you guys appreciate phosphorus, but when you're at a restaurant or at the end of a bar and you tell somebody you wrote a book about phosphorus, that's the quickest way to get the extra seat. Scramble. But once you start telling stories about how its historical use, how it affects us today, both in very positive ways and increasingly in negative ways, you get people. And so, this book it's not science-y, I don't think. And I don't think it's an environmental rant. I'm a reporter. I happen to cover the environment. If I covered something else, I'd do it in the same fashion, but this is just the way my life or career trajectory stacked up. So it's meant to engage a lay reader, and it's got a lot of stories in it. And the first one starts in Florida, in Cape Coral.
Yeah, Florida shows up often in the book.
I came down here probably 5 or 6 times to doing reporting for the book. And then I was also down here in June, not here, but in Stewart and Fort Myers doing a story for I don't work at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel anymore, and I from time to time do work for the New York Times, and I did a story on Lake Okeechobee's woes and the coastal woes that go along with it.
So what makes Florida so unique in its relationship to phosphorus?
Well, what kept bringing me back was Okeechobee, and just what an intractable problem that is from so many different angles, and how to go forward, because you have to go forward. If you don't go forward, it's just going to get worse and worse. So what brought me down was, I think the first time I came down was like 2016, and I just saw on like Yahoo News or something. I was opening up my mail. I saw that 90% of Lake Okeechobee was covered in cyanobacteria. I was like, whoa. And then I didn't know anything about the lake, and I realized now, or I know now, that it's, the second biggest freshwater lake entirely inside the continental United States. It's been managed like almost no other lake in the country, and it's a source of phosphorus troubles, Lake Erie notwithstanding, like no other place. And what I really find compelling about this issue down there in that part of the state is that it's bringing in people who aren't traditional environmentalists. It's bringing in just regular people. I went to a meeting, I think it was in the summer of 2019 at Stewart City Hall. And I can't remember the name of the coalition, but it was a coalition of the whole spectrum of, economics and political worlds. And so this isn't some abstract, concern. It's not like worrying about, from Southeast Florida, worrying about grizzlies in Alaska. It's worrying about, your kids' health, your property value, and, it gets at the essence of a community, because Lake Okeechobee shows that everything is tied together. This problem coming down the St. Lucie River isn't created by the people who live in the Stewart area, but they're suffering from it. And similar case on Fort Myers, or along the communities along the Tallahassee. Your rivers are hard to pronounce. But it's a similar story in Fort Myers, and that's really what brought me to Florida. But there were some other things too going on, with like the study of some of the sea life being ravaged by some neurological diseases, that there's concern that this could be a canary in the coal mine for humans. And I'm not saying that toxic algae is going to give you ALS, but some people are, and there's research going on that's trying to make the correlation between exposure to some of these heavily infested waters and the increased rates of ALS. They're trying to turn that into causation.
So what is very fast death factor?
Very fast death factor is, it's a cyanotoxin. So yeah, that was, I can't remember if it's microcystis. I think it's microcystis is the cyanobacteria, and microcystin is the toxin. And you ask that because it's in the book, because I can't remember where it is in the book. One thing about, at least when I do one of these books, is I don't like to go back and look at it. So there's so much material that got left on the chopping floor that I'm not always
But that's
sure.
a scientific term, like somebody came up with a
Very
term.
fast death factor. Yeah, it sounds like a punk rock band. But that's, it was, it's a derivative. It was actually used, the government had made some dastardly poisons for nefarious purposes. And this poison, which I don't think that they ended up concluding that this couple, they were in Northern California, near Yosemite, I believe, and it was a husband and a wife and a dog, and they all died just on the hiking trail. And there was no sign of foul play. And at the time, the speculation was there were algal blooms in the area, and that was the best answer they could come up with. And I think they've ended up concluding it was non-determinate, but it could have been hyperthermia. They overheated. But the fact that this was discussed largely and widely, that this algae killed these people, was striking, because this algae, which produces this toxin, I mean, there's a bunch of algae, there's a bunch of toxins, but the one that I write about mostly in the book is microcystin. That killed dozens of people in Brazil back in the mid to late 90s at a dialysis center. The toxin got into the water supply, and these compromised people perished. There's a case up in Wisconsin where a kid went swimming on a golf course, 17-year-old kid with his friends in a pond on the golf course, after, playing golf, and the kid died. And there was still some controversy over what was the exact mechanism, but that was believed by many to be the case. So there aren't people dropping dead left and right from this stuff, but it does cause chronic illnesses, and it's a liver toxin, and it causes a lot of respiratory issues. When I was in Stewart, they had put out a public health advisory because so many people were showing up at the clinics and at the emergency rooms. The first question they were asking was, "Were you in the water?" And that's not good for one of America's top 10 beach towns.
Yeah.
I don't know if I answered the question.
Yeah, no, that's a good answer. I think before we get into some of these ways that people are dying, you really do a lot to talk about how phosphorus is essential to life. In fact, you write, P is the element that completes the circle of life. Literally, nothing else can do its job. And on the front end, phosphorus is essential to what we all need. So could you speak a little bit about the positive side?
Yeah. It's why we're all here. I mean, physically, why? And there would be no life on Earth without phosphorus. I mean, I think it's Isaac Asimov referred to it as life's bottleneck. There is no alternative or replacement for phosphorus. It's in every living cell. And for a long time, it regulated life on Earth naturally. The phosphorus that seeped into the living world came from just igneous rocks. After Earth cooled, these molecules, phosphates actually, but just called phosphorus, leached into the living world and opened the door to life. And the thing about it that I find compelling back then and up to this day is that this phosphorus never went away. It would cycle in and out of the living world. It was constantly being reused, and it was kind of like the governor of life on this planet. And humans, once they started their agriculture enterprises, realized that soils would become depleted and non-productive very quickly, and they needed to be replenished with whatever would make stuff grow. They didn't know it at the time, but it was phosphorus. And the book gets into some of this early history, and then it progresses pretty quickly to the 1800s, when chemists of the time realized what it was about bird poop or animal poop or bones that was making turnips in England explode in growth, and that set us on a hunt. And that's when we unleashed. It was a trickle of phosphorus into the natural world, and we were reusing it through just common agriculture practices. When we figured out how to bypass that natural flow and turn to trickle into a gusher, it led to billions and billions of human beings being able to live on this planet. But it hasn't come without costs, because the phosphorus isn't just great at growing corn and soy and wheat. It grows stuff we don't want, namely this algae that we were just talking about.
What is and where is Bone Valley?
Okay, so Bone Valley is, I don't even know where I oriented here in the state. Like, how far is Tampa from here?
It's like an hour and a half west. Yeah,
so Bone Valley is east of Tampa, and that's I mean, I don't need to tell people here. I guess it's phosphorus mining country, and it's where most of our chemical fertilizer comes from. That was really interesting too, being in Stewart and hearing these people upset. They weren't upset about phosphorus; they were upset about the algae, and they didn't really have they didn't connect this dot to what was going on 2.5-3 hours northwest of them with what was going on in their backyard canal. And so, yeah, Bone Valley has been ground zero for phosphorus mining since the early 1900s, maybe 1890s. And, it's what keeps America's and the world's agriculture systems humming along.
And particularly in Florida, because there isn't phosphorus mining going on all over the world.
No, there's not. So this is what's interesting going forward with phosphorus. We have most of the deposits, the reserves, the mineable stuff that is in the United States is found here in Florida. And we've been harvesting it at such a pace that it's been projected in 3 or 4 decades it's going to play out. And now there's some other deposits in Idaho and North Carolina, and I think in Montana, but they're not nearly as significant. And once these deposits play out, there's going to be pressure for us to go elsewhere to find it. And it's not spread, as you mentioned, to universally across the planet. It's in these relatively rare pockets, the largest of which is in Western Sahara and Morocco. And they have, right now, 80%, 70 to 80% of the world's reserves. So when you think about energy security, that's a daunting prospect. But there are workarounds to oil. There aren't any workarounds to phosphorus. So we're going to be dependent on countries who may or may not have our nutritional security, at the forefront of their concerns. And this could be problematic going forward.
And going back to Lake Okeechobee and the Everglades, I think a lot of us in this room are acutely aware of the challenges and our past failures in managing our water and these systems. You spending a lot of time looking at Florida, what do you see as the path, or is there hope for us to address these legacy phosphorus issues?
Well, there's always hope. I mean, that's why we're all out of bed today. Right? You've got to be an optimist on this planet, or you won't last long. But there are very complicated, complex, and confounding problems tied to the overdosing of Lake Okeechobee with phosphorus and the resulting algal blooms. That just real quickly, if some people don't know this, but Lake Okeechobee is largely, it's a natural lake, but it's got this dike around it. It was built, the first dike was built, I think, in the 1920s or something, and it's collapsed a couple of times, and the Army Corps' answer is always to make it bigger. And so they made it real big in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, but they didn't, they call them the Corps of Engineers, but these guys were just pilers. They didn't engineer this Lake Okeechobee dike as much as they just piled it high. And it became apparent in the 1980s and 90s that this thing was in danger of collapsing. And when it collapsed in 1924 and 1926, I believe, it claimed thousands of lives. If it collapsed today, it would claim up to tens of thousands of lives. I think they say 40,000 people are in its flood path. So the Army Corps they just finished it this year. They've been fortifying the dike around the lake, so it's not in danger of collapsing if the water level gets too high. But still, they've got to manage that water, because if it does get too high, even with a fortified dike, it's in danger of collapsing. So water gets released down canals that flow into rivers, the St. Lucie on the east coast and the Caloosahatchee on the west. And they're not just releasing water in midsummer when they're doing this, they're releasing all the toxic algae. So this is Lake Okeechobee is so warm and shallow, and it's got so much nutrients in it from more than a century of farming and development upstream, up here, that it's the perfect incubator for this toxic algae. And what's the solution? Well, the Army Corps is at it again. They're building, and you guys are pretty much all from Florida, aren't you? I mean, but yeah, they're building the stormwater treatment, this massive reservoir south of Lake Okeechobee. And the idea is to capture some of these toxic flows before they get dispersed to the coasts, and then run them through special wetlands that will pull out the phosphorus, and then the water can take its lazy run down the peninsula and out the tip of Florida. The problem is that reservoir isn't nearly as big as it needs to be. And I was talking to a guy, Bill Mitch. Is that somebody that? Yeah, he's a big water guy. He's won the Stockholm Water Prize, which is like the Nobel Prize for water research, and he's hypercritical of this ongoing construction. It's a $3 or $4 billion project, and he says, and this is something that was really resonating with me on the tour yesterday. His message is, if you're going to fix things, you got to recreate what's naturally there on the landscape. And if you look at Florida on the ground or from the air, there's nothing that resembles a massive bathtub that's going to be 37 feet off the landscape. And he says, what we need is more acres, shallower water, and to let that water laze its way out to the Everglades. And we don't have that right now. And we had an opportunity to do it 10 years ago. There was money set aside and there was the political will, but there were bumps hitting the road, and that set Florida back, I think, significantly, not irrevocably, but what's being built down there is, and this is just my reporting, I'm not an expert on this, but this is what I got from spending about 6 or 7 weeks this summer working on this. What we got down there, by most accounts, is inadequate. So there's still going to be toxic flows going to the East Coast, the Atlantic Coast, and the Gulf Coast for the foreseeable future.
So what are some of your impressions of what you've seen here so far on the tours and our approach to landscaping? Do you see this having a tie-in to these issues downstream?
Absolutely. It's a little like Thoreau could find the universe in his backyard, right? Well, you can kind of see it in a garden in your backyard too, just the sustainability of it all and the cycle of it all. And, my backyard I live in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and it's, green. And I don't even know this is landscaping conference. I should know what type of grasses I have growing in my backyard, but it's just good old grass. And it just kind of takes care of itself. But I lived in Utah, and we bought a house in Utah, and then I thought I was lucky when a parcel adjacent to my house came available, and it was very cheap, so I bought it. And, I forgot I wasn't living in Wisconsin and that it wouldn't largely take care of itself. And so I ended up with like a 3/4 of an acre lot that the first summer I just thought, oh, I'll just let nature take its course, and goat heads took over. And I don't know if you have goat heads here, but it's like this thistle, this spike that it pops. It's popped my bike tires many, many times. And then I started to realize the beast that I was wrestling with. And fortunately, we moved, because I don't know if I was up. I don't know if I was up for the task. But what it taught me, if nothing else, was the value in a nice, tidy lot, a small lot. And that's what I really enjoyed about looking at the developments yesterday. And we have this in Milwaukee too. I live on a postage stamp of a lot. I mean, I wouldn't know the square footage, but I can mow my back lawn in 6 minutes, 5 minutes or something. But we also have parks, lots of great parks. And so you have this closer to the center of Milwaukee, because that's how the area obviously developed. And the ethos at the time was small lots, big parks, happy community. And it worked for a long time. But when, the suburbs started exploding in the 60s and 70s, they didn't take that ethic with them. And so you have areas outside of Milwaukee proper that have half-acre or acre lots, and it's absurd that the only time people seem to spend on them is when they're mowing them. It's like, I love the idea. That's one thought I had yesterday, is like, I do like the idea of going barefoot in grass. It just appeals to me, but I never do. I just like the idea of, it's like having a swimming pool that you never jump in, and it's too high of a price to pay for that kind of an indulgence. So yeah, I saw some really neat things, and I think it's all what you do on the small scale, on the small level, can be scaled up, and that's really what this book is about. It's about finding that balance that's nature's just itching to have, that we just keep fighting and embracing it and pulling it along. So
yeah, the subtitle of the book is Phosphorus in a World Out of Balance.
Yes.
And you seem to suggest that we can regain our balance somehow if we shift our way of thinking about how we relate to this element, our natural resources. There was one line that you write: "It is undeniable that we have cracked the circle of life and turned it into a straight line, and that line has an end, whether it is in 100 or 400 years."
Yeah. I mean, the mineable reserves are going to play out at some point. There was a researcher from Australia in 2011. She scared a bunch of people by looking at our consumption and looking at our reserves and projecting that we could run out of mineable phosphorus in 70 to 80 years. That's been hotly disputed by the phosphorus industry and by other academics. But nobody says it's endless. And, even the most optimistic will say, yeah, we're looking at about 300 or 400 years. And, at which point the easy stuff's gone and the things are going to get tough. But talking about this circle and this line, I want to back up a little bit, if that's okay, and talk about how once we realized that certain materials were, and this is in the early 1800s, the manure had been used forever, and human and animal, but the pressure was on, particularly in England, an island country with limited arable land and going through a mini ice age, and so they were desperate to keep their crops productive. And they ended up figuring out that bones, and they didn't know why, but bones worked really well at growing crops. And so they started scavenging for bones. And this took them into some pretty dark places, because 1815 was the Battle of Waterloo, and like 40,000 people fell in like 10 hours, which is just unfathomable. You can't find a bone on that battlefield today, and it's not because they were all put in some sacred massive grave. It's because the British came over and, reaped the spoils of war, harvested all the bones off the battlefield, built special mills back in the UK to grind up the bones and put them on crops. And at the time, these were their sons' bones and not just their enemies'. And this happened on battlefields across Europe, and there's only so many bones out there. I mean, they were raiding catacombs in Egypt and just anything they could find, and those bones played out, and so that sent them on the hunt for something else, and that something else turned out to be bird poop coming from the Guano Islands of South America off of Peru in 1830 or so, and now here's when chemistry starts getting involved. They brought back it was von Humboldt was on his great excursion in the early 1800s, and he brought back a batch of this miracle grow stuff. I mean, it literally, we now know, has like an NPK ratio similar to what you could buy at a co-op. They brought it back and they analyzed it, and they found that it was rich with phosphorus, nitrogen, and potassium, and that started a guano rush. And so this really came at the right time for humanity, if you're looking at it from a perspective of humanity's growing exponentially as a good thing, and it's hard to argue not, because we all deserve to be here. But they hit these islands really hard, and at the time they thought that they would never run out. They thought that there was so much bird poop, and the reason there was so much bird poop on these islands was because it's so dry there, and the Humboldt current coming up from the southern hemisphere carries with it lots and lots of life, which brings with it lots and lots of fish, which brings in birds, and those birds eat the fish, and they need to nest and poop, and they're doing it on these islands. And these islands literally had mountains of bird poop. And so the 1830s, we started mining this stuff, thinking that it would last forever, and by the 1870s, it was gone, and by the 1880s, we're here in Florida looking for rock. So I bring this up because this is us on a straight line. Just use it. Use as much as you want, and if it washes away, we got more. Just use it. And nobody was thinking at the time, and too few people are thinking today, that it's not meant to be used and tossed away. When you think about what the British were willing to do to eat the bones of their sons, I mean, that's a simplification, but what would they do if they could see a lagoon of manure at a CAFO today? They wouldn't see it as yuck. They'd see it as yum. They would recognize it for the nutritional trove that it is. And that's, when we talk about circles and lines, that's how we get the circle back. We're never going to have this natural cycling that existed into antiquity. We can't. There's too many of us. We know too much. But we can do something to try to engineer it back, and that'll do two things. That will preserve the reserves that we have now, and it'll help our water immensely. And why we're not doing it is a mystery to me, but I guess not everybody in the world spent 3 or 4 years looking into this and then writing a book about it. But that's the goal of this book, is to help people connect the dots to see the circle and try to get away from the line.
Yeah, it's a different mode of thinking. When we shift from the line to bringing back the loop, but it is a struggle because, for example, as you heard yesterday, one of our practices that we believe is very important in these alternative landscape systems is to improve the soil health with good amendments to build biological diversity from the ground up. And composting is, as we've seen, very beneficial for that.
Mm-hmm.
But there are some who will look at compost and say, well, it contains phosphorus, so it's bad. And even though that phosphorus, we're trying to keep it in the loop. We're
Mm-hmm.
trying to keep it cycling through our food systems and not washing out to sea. So how do we shift people's mode of thinking, and what types of ways have you found are effective at telling these stories to help people maybe understand that we need to start looking at this in a circle?
Well, phosphorus shouldn't be a dirty word any more than fire should be, but they're very similar. And so, if you're going to compost, it better go back on the land to grow something, because it's going to go somewhere at some point. And everything goes downhill, and downhill is water in almost every place. Can I grab that book? There's a section in this that really distills the whole issue for me that I would like to. And reading, well, these aren't really my own words because I'm quoting somebody, but reading your own words is really awkward. So if I sound awkward, forgive me, it won't last long. Okay, so there's this guy, F.H. King, who was an undersecretary of the Agriculture in the early 1900s, and he went over to China and to Korea and Japan in 1909 to write a book called Farmers of 40 Centuries. And what his goal was to figure out why in the early 1900s we were running into crop productivity issues on lands that had only been farmed for 2 or 3 generations, when over in Asia they'd been going for 4,000 years on the same plot of land. What was their secret? And he saw it was thrift, and it was turning that line into a circle. And I'll just read, he wrote, "When we reflect on the depleted fertility of our own older farmlands, comparatively few of which have seen a century's service, and upon the enormous quantity of mineral fertilizers which are being applied annually to them in order to secure paying yields," King wrote, "it becomes evident that the time is here when profound consideration should be given to the Asian practices that have maintained crop sustainability throughout the centuries." And then he got real granular, and to the point where he went to this farm and he saw how they were doing this, and he saw a kid who, well, I'll tell you what he saw. I'll read it. He saw a kid basically follow a cow was on a wheel, and that wheel was powering a well for water to grow rice. And the kid was following the cow around, and every time the cow pooped, he was putting it into a container where it could be composted and put back out on the land. And when he saw the fact that this kid was tasked with this, he was upset. He thought that it was, borderline abuse. And then he writes, quote, "There came a flash of resentment that such a task was set for the lad, for we were only beginning to realize what lengths the practice of economy may go. But there was nothing irksome suggested in the boy's face," King reported. Quote, "He performed the duty as a matter of course, and as we thought it through, there was no reason why it should be otherwise. In fact, the only right course was being taken. Conditions would have been worse if the collection had not been made. It made possible more rice. Character of substantial quality was building in the lad, which meant thrift in the growing man and continued life for a nation." That's all right there, So, thank you for indulging me on that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that story. I'm glad you read it. It's very captivating. There are a lot of really great little stories and vignettes across the book that take us on this romp through history and around the globe. And I serve on the board of 1,000 Friends of Florida, which is a great organization, and we had our board meeting at our farm, and I got everybody on the board a copy of your book.
Mhm.
And Paul, who's here today, he's our executive director, and he's also a journalist. And he told me that it's really quite remarkable that someone could write a page turner on phosphorus. I think it's a great compliment to you as a journalist and an author, because not only is it a very interesting book on phosphorus, it really truly is a page turner. It's something that you don't want to put down. There's a lot of important information, but more importantly, I think a lot of really great storytelling. And I think that's something that we're seeking here at the Outside Collab, and it's been mentioned many times already. That we need to become good storytellers to share our view of an alternative ecological approach to landscapes with our stakeholders and with the home owners and the public, to help people maybe make this shift in their way of looking at the world. Just curious, what tips or suggestions or thoughts do you have on how to tell good stories around the environment and taking a line and turning it into a loop?
Well, I mean, for me, it's kind of an emotional thing. It's not hard to do because I grew up in Wisconsin, not far from Lake Michigan, and I spent a lot of my summers up on northern Lake Michigan. And so the health of those waters is really personal to me. When I graduated from college, I grew up in Wisconsin, went to school in Michigan, and then went out west to Wyoming, Idaho, and Utah, where I started working at newspapers. And I got kind of a crash course on environmental journalism out there, because at the time, wolf reintroduction was a big deal, grizzly bear restoration, and salmon recovery. And so I was kind of exposed to the culture of, environmentalism and the conflict that understanding the science of these issues to solve them is easy. It's when you overlay human values on them is when it really gets sticky and interesting, at least from a journalistic perspective. But when I came back from the West, I was out there for a decade or so, a little more. I came back and I looked at the lake in a completely different way. I was in the desert for 10 years. And when I came back, and I just found myself drawn to Lake Michigan over and over. And it's just because I have so many fond memories. And this is one thing. So this is where I can tell stories, because it's just kind of, it's in my essence. But what I worry about is my kids. I expose them to the lake, and we spend as much time as possible. But there's a lot of times when you can't swim at beaches, and once these kids can't go swimming, they're going to lose that experience, and the lake in a generation is going to lose its constituency for people to look out for it. And that can be a lake up as big as Lake Erie, Lake Michigan, or anything down here. I was at the University of Wisconsin about a month and a half ago doing a talk, and it's in Madison, Wisconsin, and it's on Lake Mendota, which is just a glorious lake, but unfortunately it's surrounded by dairies, and it's just saturated with phosphorus, and it grows algae at an incredible rate. And so I did a talk there because I got a comedian on board. This guy's name is Charlie Behrens, and he's like a professional Wisconsin guy. He talks with the accent and drinks all the time, and but it's an act. He's a funny, thoughtful guy. And I thought, he's famous up there. And I thought, if I could get Charlie Behrens, because he's a University of Wisconsin graduate, he's always talking about the Student Union Terrace, which is on the lake. His line is, if I only had 3 beers left to drink in my life, 2 of them would be there. So that told me he liked the lake. And so I reached out to him, and then I got a soil science guy, because it's the University of Wisconsin, it's a great land-grant university. And then I got the head of the limnology department, study of freshwater sciences. That is literally, the office is cantilevered out over the lake. It is literally on Lake Mendota, which makes Lake Mendota one of the most intensely studied lakes in the world. And I thought, there's a thing up in Wisconsin at the university system, they call it the Wisconsin idea. And it's really not an idea as much as it is common sense. And that is, we take what we learn through research at the universities, and we don't put it in journals and bury it in stacks. We take it to the people. And so this was trying to make that Wisconsin idea manifest. And so we had a great talk, and there's competing interests. We're in the middle of Dairyland, but we're also in the middle of a state that has 15,000 freshwater lakes. So I thought it was pretty productive. But what was notable, talking about telling stories, was I said, look behind us. Nobody's swimming. There's kids on the dock, but there's nobody swimming. That's where we should start. We should start with what's it going to take to get kids in the water and work backwards from there, because that will solve everything, and that will address nutrient overloading. Right now, it's almost we're on separate tracks where safe water, whether to swim or to drink, Lake Erie lost, the city of Toledo lost its drinking supply in 2014 for several days because of a toxic plume of algae got sucked into the water treatment plant intake pipes. So we're on this path where, putting food on our table or swimming in water, what do we want? And we want both, and we can have both. So I did this talk on a Thursday. I think it was Friday. It might have been Saturday. There were kids behind us. They just weren't in the water. They were on like this dock that goes in seasonally. The day or two after I gave that talk, there were 200 kids on the dock. They should have been in the water. The dock collapsed. Nobody was killed or anything, but these guys should have been in the water, and they were, relegated to this aluminum platform of a dock that couldn't sustain all the people who had an interest in being in the lake. And that to me would have been in this book. We got to get to a different place.
Yeah.
So
that's interesting. There's a really powerful book that was written a while back by Richard Louv called "The Last Child in the Woods." Are you familiar with
No.
this book? Probably some in this room are. He talks about how maybe my generation, your generation, was the last generation of kids in this country who were free to go outside and to roam, and to get lost in the woods and to discover their relationship with nature in a natural way, without any supervision, without any guidance, but just by exploring and playing.
Mm-hmm.
But that we've lost that children are now so disconnected from nature. We have very little nature around our homes, and instead we're nurturing a fear of nature. And so I think we have the same problem with our landscapes that you have with your lake, that the kids are just not going outside.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's one of the things that we can accomplish, and part of the story we can tell is that if we bring back an ecological, regenerative, and sustainable landscape to these communities around the homes, well, then maybe the kids can learn not to fear the bees, and learn to discover the joy of watching a caterpillar turn into a chrysalis, and turn into a butterfly, and flutter around their yard. So I think there's a lot of similarities in the story that you tell, and the story that we would like to tell, because I think ultimately it is about this idea that we're trying to reconnect with nature's processes,
Mm-hmm.
and which are cyclical, and to put life back at the center of how we think and what we're doing. So I think that's fabulous. I did want to ask you though, because there are solutions, and you speak about some things that you've seen around the world, different technologies maybe that have been implemented elsewhere. There's some things that come to mind specifically that would be appropriate here in Florida in dealing with phosphorus.
Yeah, I mean, this is big dairy country, right? Where we are. So there was this report that came out earlier this year about up in Wisconsin, which is big dairy country. The big farmers. I'm agnostic as far as the size of the farm. We talked a little bit about this last night. I think in some ways we can get a better handle on the problem. So one of the reasons we're in this problem, in this fix, is because in 1972 we get the Clean Water Act, but the Clean Water Act largely exempted agriculture, non-point source pollution that was on the landscape rather than pollution coming out of a pipe or a smokestack. And the rationale was you can plug a pipe or a smokestack, or at least scrub the stuff coming out of it, and that's not, technology can handle that. You can't really squeegee a farm field. That was 1972. Things have changed a lot in the last half century, and the scale of the farms very often now are so big that they are by definition point source polluters, and they should be treated as such. This isn't bad because the pressure is coming to do more with this manure. This report I was just referring to in Wisconsin talked about this farmer bought an anaerobic digester. I think he had like a 5,000 head CAFO dairy, and he was set to make as much money in methane this year as he was getting in milk. So, and that's not even getting at the nutrients in it. And, this will cost something, to develop the technologies to pull out the nitrogen and the phosphorus. But then you can move it, like up in Wisconsin, if you have to move it more than 10 miles, the farmers say it's an economic loser. They can't survive doing that. So they put it on the land, whether the land needs it or not. If we can start treating this stuff as the resource through treatment, well, that's a win-win, and it's going to cost money, but with not doing it has its own costs, and that's Stewart beaches, being posted, don't swim, Great Lakes beaches being posted, don't swim. That's a big cost. It just doesn't show up on a ledger. So that was one thing that, got me thinking, well, this isn't hopeless. And another thing that was really interesting was in Hamburg, Germany. So Hamburg figures prominently in this whole story. And can I digress a little bit?
Please.
So the story of phosphorus starts in Hamburg in 1669, I believe. There was an alchemist on the hunt, as they all were, for the philosopher's stone, which was this mythical substance that they believed could transform base metals like lead into gold and silver. The thought at the time was all metals were evolving. We just needed to find what was causing that evolution and make money out of it. And so this guy believed he could isolate the philosopher's stone from the human waste stream, urine specifically. So he got vats and vats of urine and did a lot of hocus pocus, but he cooked it. I mean, he basically cooked it, but there were some other chemical things going on there. I actually found a translation of his method. It was in French, and I had to get somebody to translate it into English for me. And it basically, to simplify it, he cooked it at an insanely high heat for like 3 weeks, adding this and that. And at the end, what precipitated out were these glowing nuggets, which he thought was the philosopher's stone, but they were actually nuggets of elemental pure phosphorus, which doesn't exist on its own in nature. It's typically tied up with oxygen atoms to make phosphates. So this stuff it glowed in the dark. It was phosphorescent. And so it was kind of a curiosity. I mean, it turned out urine couldn't turn anything gold. Maybe a snowbank, maybe. But, all right. So it was just kind of it was like displayed in courts across Europe. You could draw on a wall and, it would glow. But the unfortunate thing about this phosphorus was if it heated above like 85 Fahrenheit, it combusts and just bursts into flame. It goes looking for those oxygen atoms. And so it wasn't long till this substance discovered in Hamburg became used as a weapon, and match tips. Lucifer matches had phosphorus tips. And then World War II comes along, and the Allies burn Hamburg to the ground with fire bombs. Many of them were made out of phosphorus. So the opening of this book, actually, a lot of these bombs, as they are wont to do, miss their target, and the phosphorus shards of which, when it explodes, it looks just like a firework, just those glowing globules. Only when these things land, they don't snuff out. They'll burn through anything, like down to the bone. If it hits a human, into the bone. But if it hits water, it stabilizes. And unfortunately, it looks a lot like amber. And more unfortunately, amber is big business up on the Baltic coast and also along the Elbe River, because that used to be a conifer forest millions of years ago. And the resin is now amber, and it's highly prized. And it looks a lot like phosphorus. So I opened the story with this guy who's walking along the shore of the Baltic coast about an hour and 20 minutes from Hamburg. And he picks up what he thought was, I think he thought it was amber, and put it in his pocket. and then his leg exploded and or burst into flames, and he went into the sea instinctively, and it doused it. This was in December. I went to the very place where it happened, and I was with a translator, and I kept picking up little pieces that looked like they could be amber, and I showed it to him once. He's like, yeah, it looked like that. And then I showed him another one, and this is all going through translation, or through a translator. And he's like, yeah, and he kind of looks away, and finally the translator, who was a colleague of, or a student, co-student, what is that, a cohort, she was in my cohort at Columbia, she's Swiss, and she just turns and says in dirtier language than this, will you just leave him alone? It's traumatizing him. Dude, she did say that in English, I remember, dude. Anyway, he went into the water, and then he'd come out and it would combust again. And so they were going to bring in a helicopter, but they thought he'd take down the helicopter. And they finally got an ambulance, and they packed his leg in wet towels, and he survived, but he had burns on about 60% of his body. Anyway, that's Phosphorus's discovery. Phosphorus's dark side, the devil's element. It's called that because it combusts, and it's the 13th element that was discovered. That's the first two chapters. The third chapter and the end of this story is in Hamburg as well. Western Europe really has very limited, almost none. Although there's a deposit up in Norway that they're probing right now, but they don't have fertilizer of their own. They're always dependent on other countries. And to help alleviate this situation, Germany has passed a law where in 2029, all the major wastewater treatment plants have to basically remove all the phosphorus from their waste stream. So the first plant going up is in Hamburg, Germany, on the banks of the Elbe River. And that is, they know the story of phosphorus over there, and they say this is phosphorus coming home. We're reestablishing this loop. And I don't know what the cost is, but they've calculated the cost of not doing it is greater, both environmentally and economically. So that's going to be something interesting to follow. And it's something that's directly applicable to here, because when we talked yesterday on the tours about how many acres, 27,000 acres, maybe 30,000 some residents. I mean, that's going to be a huge, just don't talk about the lawns, or not the lawns, the landscape. Think about the load to the wastewater treatment plants, because already Lake Okeechobee is receiving up to 10 times the amount of phosphorus it can handle. Most of that's coming off of agriculture. But this is going to put the pressure on developers too. And it's not an insurmountable problem. I mean, people deserve to have houses and to live. I don't know if they deserve, but they should be able to live where they want to live. And so I don't think it's an option to just, it isn't an option to just say you can't develop that. But it is an option to say you can develop it, but you got to do it with a 21st century mentality and not a 20th.
Yeah, that's what we're aiming for here at the Outside Collab, and I believe that Tavistock is as well. We have a little bit of time, and I'd like to give the audience a chance to maybe ask a few questions. So, Caroline, we've got a question up front.
So regarding Okeechobee, most of the land that's below Okeechobee, where its natural flow goes toward, is pretty much sugarcane. Mm-hmm. And as far as I know, the plan was as soon as they play out the sugarcane, because it's like dropped like 8 feet over the last like 50 years, because it's all organic soils. They were just going to turn that into housing development. Do you know if there's anything about that? Where I think it's dumb, of course, but
I don't know anything about that. I mean, I do know not too long ago they had set aside funds and they had an agreement, right, with one of the big sugar companies to buy a bunch of acres. What they're doing right now is that reservoir is 10,000 acres, and they're saying they need like 10 times that, and it's only going to come from that land. Or if it doesn't come, we're going to just be trapped in the cycle that we're trapped in right now, and it's probably going to get worse. So I don't know if everybody heard that. The agreement was to get 250,000 acres, and Governor Scott vetoed it, so they settled for 1/10 that. and they also had money for it. And now, as I understand it, the legislature has passed some legislation that prohibits invoking eminent domain to claim it. So well, he said, "Welcome to Florida." Yeah.
I wanted to check. I've heard that there are, or read that there are some crops that will assimilate phosphorus from algae. Have you heard in your research or your travels any efforts to harvest the algae from the lakes?
No, but that's an intuitive idea, and I think it's probably going to be explored as we do play out the concentrate. So I was talking earlier about the rock deposits. Those were igneous rocks that had relatively low percentage phosphorus, but the sedimentary rocks, certain deposits, it's basically just the remnants of dead sea life decaying or falling to the ocean floor and stacking up and turning into sedimentary rock. And they're few and far between. And what we've done is we've just unleashed all that. I'm just going to think of it as energy into the environment. And it's not as concentrated as it is if it's in a nodule, but over time, like Lake Erie, western basin of Lake Erie is so overloaded with manure that those sediments have got to have some fertilizing properties. That's not without it. Trying to harvest that has got a lot of other issues. I mean, there's other toxins or pollutants tied up in that, and there's also habitat, fish habitat. I don't think anybody wants to go mine the bottom of a Great Lake, but it could be a different story in a century or two.
So back to Lake Okeechobee, I'm a member of Friends of the Everglades, and what they are saying is that the sugar industry promised to donate to that mitigation, and they haven't kept their word. If you want to know more about what's going on at Lake Okeechobee, join Friends of Everglades. You need to join.
Yeah, I spent an afternoon with, I believe it was the executive director of Friends. Her name's escaping me at the moment, but yeah.
Did you? Because I haven't read the book, I apologize. Have you looked at the anaerobic digestion that's going on in Australia and New Zealand? And there's a reference to it in Monty Python, which I think you'd like.
No, I'm not familiar with
Oh,
that.
because it's very well developed in Australia and New Zealand.
Mm-hmm.
They don't, I think they see it as a profit-making opportunity, as you mentioned in Wisconsin, rather than a cost.
Yeah, and that's
And
go
I've
ahead.
never understood why Florida was different. In fact, I come from the Midwest, and it really struck me when I got here that what we think of as normal behavior is not considered expected here.
Well, it's the anaerobic digesting is not universally embraced at the moment in Wisconsin either. And as promising as I think it is, it also has some problems in that you could find yourself in a situation where people are basically raising manure, or making manure instead of milk, because like what's working for Wisconsin right now are California credits for alternative fuels. They're paying the farmer. The Californians are paying Wisconsin farmers to make manure. And you don't want to get to a point where, and we kind of almost are there. This summer, this is how nobody should be happy with this system right now, the farmers included. And also, I don't want to vilify, demonize farmers. They're working within the system that they did help craft, but it is a system that we all politically, collectively, set up. So the system needs to change. You can't just go to an individual farmer and expect him or her to do something just out of the goodness of their heart. They're in business, and they're doing everything they can to stay in business. And to that point, I was in Madison, Wisconsin again last week at the World Dairy Expo. And I'm thinking about doing something on dairy specifically. And there were two seminars that I wanted to see. They were across the hall from each other, and one was after the other. The first one was rotisserie or robot. And they were talking about, do you want to get like a carousel to milk the cows in an automated fashion, or get the robots? And they had two guys telling their stories, and they were both talking about how this was just not the enterprise that their grandfathers were involved in. Across the hall was a seminar after that, mental health in the family dairy farm. And farmers are killing themselves at 3 times the rate of the national average right now. Yeah. Okay. So they're not happy with the situation, and the situation is so grim that this summer in Milwaukee, we were running for about a week, as I understand it, like 35,000 gallons of raw milk through the wastewater treatment system because there was a glut in the supply chain, and milk is eminently perishable, and it was waste. So we ran it through, treated it, and dumped it in Lake Michigan. And it happened a lot during COVID as well. But that was, at that point it was like everything's fouled up right now. But it happened again this summer. So we've got a capacity issue that needs to be addressed.
We have time maybe for one more question.
Maybe so. Well, probably none. But if there is something, I would like to do something on dairy, just the dairy industry, how it evolved, where we're at, and where it could be headed. Because I live in Dairyland, and I cover water, and it's kind of a logical nexus for what I'm interested in. Yeah. Yeah. Air, yeah. Well, there is a book. I was going to do milk. I thought about just milk, but Mark Kurlansky, who did cod and salt, also happened to do milk. So he beat me to the punch.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for writing these excellent books and for coming here and sharing your stories with us today.
Thanks for having me. This is great work that you guys are doing.